Hey everybody, welcome back to yet another Kaiju Customs video. Today we're customizing, well, not necessarily Ultraman Ginga, but we're gonna customize him into the saucer monster Nova. So you may be wondering why exactly we have Ultraman Ginga here at the start, and that's basically just because he's gonna serve as our base for Nova, because there's no real figure that looks enough like Nova to base it off of. So I just used the spare Spark Doll Ginga that I had lying around as a base for Nova, and basically we end up molding around him and creating Nova from scratch essentially. And also you just saw we pulled out a Tyrant figure for a split second and cut off his scythe on his one hand to use for Nova's left arm, which has a scythe on the end of it. And so then I used some epoxy clay, the same that I used for Femigon, and molded it around Tyrant's scythe, pairing it up with the now cut in half Ultraman Ginga arm. And it basically curled it in a way so that it would be sticking up so that Nova could have that little signature pose or whatever where he has his scythe up at the ready. And then once that was done, I mixed together some more epoxy clay sculpt and made the whip arm for Nova. And Nova's right arm is comprised of 3 whips, 2 smaller ones and one that is a tad larger than the other 2. So I molded all 3 of those separately and attached them all to the other Ginga half arm now. And the way that I let this set, I essentially planned out how I wanted the whips to dry, like what sort of curvature on them and stuff, and essentially let them sit on top of one of the epoxy clay buckets and just dry in a curved shape so that they would always be up and at the ready. Next, the most difficult step of this entire process, which was Nova's head. I started off by cutting off Ginga's head and severing it basically, and then taking some more epoxy sculpt and creating a big ball. And what I tried at first was setting the ball of clay on the Ginga body at first and then sculpting the face on that way. But that proved to be very difficult because the clay kept sinking into Ginga's neck, and that was no good for trying to sculpt the face on a pretty round head. So instead what I opted to do, I opted to sculpt the eyes and mouth of Nova into the clay ball in my hand separately from the body. And by that point I had tried it about 5 or 6 times and finally got the look that I wanted. I basically used a wet toothpick to carve out the shape of the eyes and the mouth, and then used the slightly more rounded end of the Q-tip to sort of sink in those little holes that we'd created and smooth them out just a tad, although we didn't need to worry about them being too smooth because they would be covered up with a deep black paint later on. And one thing that I do dislike about how this custom came out was the fact that when the clay head was drying, it continued to still sink into Nova's neck a little bit, so the head looks a little bit fatter, I suppose, than it should. It should be a little bit more narrow and tall. But I suppose, what are you gonna do? But anyway, what I did after that was take some more of the epoxy clay sculpt and basically build up on Ginga's legs from the very bottom, and made the Ginga Spark Doll about an inch taller than it usually is. So Nova's about 6 inches tall now, with all of the clay around his legs, which also helped him balance because the 2 new arms that we made and the head made him kind of top heavy. So putting the clay around the back of his legs and building it down helped balance him out a little bit in the end. The next day, after all the clay had dried, came the ever so fun process of sanding Nova's head. And thankfully Nova's head was the only thing that I had to sand really, because both of his arms would be concealed by the fabric that we will be putting over him later. And so I went over with about 2 or 3 different grits of sandpaper on Nova's head and smoothed it out a lot. After that, the entire thing was spray painted a bright red. Then the only painting that had to be done with the brush in this case with Nova was filling in his eyes and mouth with black paint, which took a couple of seconds really just to fill in those with black paint. And then the final step was creating Nova's little cape or ghost sheet of sorts, I guess you can call it, which I basically just bought some red fabric off of Amazon and cut out the general size of Nova's head in the middle of it, draped it over Nova, cut out the armholes, and then I basically cut around the bottom until I was happy with the shape and length of it generally. And then I took another strip of red fabric and tied it around Nova's neck for his little scarf that he has. And so that finishes off Nova, which he was a pretty fun custom to make, I suppose, considering that basically no part of the original figure used the Ultra 500 Spark Doll of Ultraman Ginga is seen at all, so basically the figure was made from scratch. And one of the things that inspired me to do this custom was the old tutorial by Goji73, where he makes a custom Nova figure out of, I believe, like a lollipop and red napkins and stuff. And Nova's one of my favorite Ultra Kaiju designs, and I really wanted to have a fun version of him that I could use in perhaps Zone Fighter someday. But overall, I think the custom came out alright. I mean, there's obviously a lot that I can improve upon. In fact, I may go back later at some point and just redo the custom when I've refined my skills a tad bit, because things like the head didn't turn out exactly how I hoped they would, and the arms are a bit of a odd thing to work with, and then obviously his cloak or whatever can be remade at any time without remaking the entire figure. But you know, we'll see what that happens. If I ever do make a second one of these, then I'll make a second Kaiju Customs video about it, I suppose. But that's about it, and I'll see you here for the next episode of Kaiju Customs, which will probably be Lunatics? If not, then probably Maga Orochi, because Lunatics is going to take quite a bit of planning, and Nova was a bit of practice for Lunatics. So we'll see what happens next. I'll see you guys then.